Nigeria is a nation sitting on wealth it cannot use. Nigeria holds 37.3 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, ranking it 10th in the world and Africa's largest. On paper, that sounds formidable. When you divide it by population, the illusion collapses. Look at it this way. Saudi Arabia holds 267 billion barrels of proven reserves, shared among roughly 34 million people. That works out to approximately 7,850 barrels for every Saudi citizen. Libya holds 48 billion barrels for just 7 million people, giving each Libyan around 6,860 barrels. Venezuela sits on 303 billion barrels, distributed across 28 million people, which comes to roughly 10,820 barrels per Venezuelan. Nigeria holds 37 billion barrels for 230 million people. That comes to approximately 170 barrels per Nigerian. A Saudi citizen sits on almost 50 times more oil wealth per head than a Nigerian, a Libyan 40 times more, and a Venezuelan 64 times more. Iran has about 209 billion barrels of reserves shared among 88 million people, which comes to approximately 2,370 barrels per Iranian citizen, nearly 14 times more oil wealth per head than every Nigerian receives. So you see, Nigeria doesn't merely have less oil than these countries. It has a fundamentally different problem. A resource that can transform a small population is now a diluted and contested prize when 230 million people are fighting over it. But that's not the only issue here. Let's go deeper. With less oil reserves than the other oil giants, Nigeria still produces less oil every year compared to its counterpart. Saudi Arabia pumps almost 11 million barrels per day for 34 million people, 315 barrels per day for every 1,000 citizen. Libya produces around 1.4 million barrels per day for 7 million people, roughly 190 barrels per day per 1,000 citizens. Nigeria produces approximately 1.5 million barrels per day for 220 million people, about 7 barrels per day per 1,000 citizens. That is, Saudi Arabia generates 45 times more oil output per capita than Nigeria. Even Libya, a country fractured by civil war and constant production blockades, whose output regularly collapses due to political standoffs, generates roughly 27 times more oil revenue per citizen than Nigeria does. Nigeria and Libya pump comparable volumes of crude daily, but Libya's 7 million people share that output against Nigeria's 230 million. In 2024, Saudi Arabia earned approximately $179 billion in oil export revenues, while Nigeria's crude oil exports generated roughly $49 billion, meaning Saudi Arabia, with 1/6 of Nigeria's population, earned nearly 4 times as much from oil in a single year. That is not a different degree of the same problem. It is a different problem entirely, and it is getting worse. Nigeria's production has declined at roughly 5% per year since 2012, falling from a peak of 2.5 million barrels per day in 2010 to 1.56 million today, a drop equivalent to losing the entire output of Angola, the continent's second largest producer. The International Energy Agency projects Nigeria's production capacity could shrink further to 1.1 million barrels per day by 2028. The wealth was always thinner than advertised. It is getting thinner still, while the population it must serve keeps growing. And oil accounts for a massive chunk of our budget, even though the budget is barely enough to make any real impact in the economy. Let's explain why this is. A budget that cannot govern a giant. Now, let's come down to the most important figure on this list, the national budget. Nigeria's 2024 federal budget was $33 billion. And when Tinubu announced a budget of $37 billion, everyone screamed. But let's put it in perspective, shall we? South Africa, with a population of 65 million people, 3 times smaller than Nigeria's 230 million people, had a budget of $132 billion in 2024. That's 4 times more money for a fraction of the people. Algeria, with 44 million people, budgeted $98 billion. Egypt, with 109 million, budgeted $97 billion, all in the same year. Even Bangladesh and Indonesia outspend Nigeria per capita by multiples. Now, how does Nigeria spend that money? Of Nigeria's $34 billion budget, 30% went to debt service alone, meaning Nigeria is spending 6 times more on borrowing costs than on building schools or hospitals, in a country where over 40% of the population lives in extreme poverty. This is both a resource problem and a structural one. A government that size, serving 230 million people across 36 states with over 300 ethnic groups, cannot function on that budget. There is simply not enough money to build the administrative capacity, the infrastructure, or the institutions that reform requires. Even experts such as the World Bank and IMF say we need about $150 billion every year for 10 years to stabilize the economy and lift people from poverty. The way the country is going now, we doubt the poverty rate will have any drastic drop because the fracture is built into the foundation. Nigeria has more than 300 ethnic groups, over 500 tribes, with almost 600 languages, including profound religious and regional differences, making it one of the most culturally diverse countries on earth. Many of these ethnic groups aren't just separated by culture, language, and custom, but by deeply different political traditions, economic philosophies, and historical grievances. Every successful national transformation in modern history, like Japan, South Korea, Germany, Singapore, China, or even Rwanda, occurred in societies with a dominant shared cultural core. Nations reform when there is a we that agrees on what the country should become. Nigeria is more like 100 nations forced under the umbrella of a country, and for thousands of years that's how the West African region was, hundreds of nations running independent government until colonization forced us under the same identity. It is hard to have a national goal when there are subnational ideologies. Nigeria's founding independence leader, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, described the country that emerged from British amalgamation as a mere geographical expression. That was in 1947, yet it remains an accurate description today. But this isn't limited to politics. Religion is also another factor because the religion problem is structural, not incidental. Nigeria is not merely divided along ethnic lines. It is also divided along the lines of the 2 largest, most historically adversarial religions on earth. Christianity and Islam are the 2 largest religions not only in Nigeria but in the world. They differ not just in methods of worship but in their foundational conception of law, governance, gender roles, faith, and the relationship between the sacred and the political. These 2 religions map almost perfectly onto Nigeria's ethnic geography. The Hausa ethnic group in the north is 95% Muslim. The Igbo in the southeast are 98% Christian. The Yoruba of the southwest are split roughly 55% Muslim and 35% Christian. The Muslim North and Christian South separation directly intensifies ethnic fractionalization, particularly in northern Nigeria, where Islamic identity plays a dominant role in governance. 12 northern states have implemented Sharia law, an entirely different legal system operating within the same national borders as a secular constitution. This is a serious cultural difference that affects the civilization of the region. This religious ethnic intersection was a direct cause of the Biafran Civil War of 1967 between the predominantly Christian Igbo South and the Muslim Hausa Fulani North. Boko Haram, which emerged from this same northern Islamic identity politics, has affected the livelihood of millions since 2011. It is hard to govern a group of people with this level of division and disunity. Nowhere else on the continent will you find such separation. But where did all this begin? It began from a nation that was never given time to become one. Let's rewind the clock a bit. You see, Nigeria gained independence from Britain on October 1st, 1960. Before that, in 1914, the British had amalgamated the northern and southern protectorates into a single federation, not because the peoples within it had any shared identity, but for administrative convenience. For the British, it was better to run a company as a single business that was as two separate businesses. Nigeria is, in the most literal sense, an invented container. Independence ended formal colonial rule, but did not erase the structures created during the colonial period. Borders, regional administration, and economic patterns shaped by colonial priorities remained. The British left in 1960. 6 years later, the first military coup occurred. 3 years after that, civil war. Compare this to the nations that successfully reformed themselves. Japan spent centuries as a unified culture before the Meiji Restoration transformed it in a generation. South Korea had a singular ethno-linguistic identity and an existential threat that forged national purpose. Even Singapore, tiny, young, multiracial, was governed by a single dominant vision imposed from the top with near-authoritarian discipline. Nigeria has had none of these conditions. It has been asked to achieve in 65 years what most functioning nations took centuries to build, when none of them had this many dysfunctions working against them. So it is fair to say that there is a false comparison with other African nations. The standard deflection is, all African countries are like this. But no, they are not. In Botswana, Rwanda, South Africa, and Zambia, 5% or fewer of the population identify as Muslim, meaning there is no active Christian-Muslim civilizational divide splitting the country in two. Botswana specifically reflects exemplary cohesiveness, democracy, stability, and sustained growth. Kenya and Ethiopia face ethnic complexity, but neither has the specific combination of a near-perfect 50-50 Christian-Muslim split mapped directly onto over 300 competing ethnic identities, operating within a country of 230 million people who speak over 500 languages with no dominant culture, a $33 billion budget, and less than 65 years of national existence. No other country on earth is disadvantaged like this. None. In surveys across sub-Saharan Africa, 58% of Nigerians identified religious conflict as a very big national problem, the highest figure recorded across all countries surveyed. No other African country produced that number. Nigeria's problem is not African. It is uniquely Nigerian, the product of a specific colonial arithmetic. Take the largest population on the continent, compress 300+ ethnic groups, and the world's two most historically adversarial religions into one border, give them 46 years of colonial rule and 65 years of independence, hand them a shrinking oil revenue to fight over, and call it a nation. The wonder is not that Nigeria struggles to reform. The wonder is that it holds together at all. And this alone is a miracle that ought to be commended.